Guys hear me?
All right, welcome everyone to this meeting of SABR's East Coast Cooperative, a group of 7 chapters in Eastern Canada and the United States who are working together to bring you more great presentations. I'm Bruce McClure, the chair of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter in Maine and New Hampshire, and tonight we have another great speaker for you. Everyone sees the players on the field, but there are so many different people who make baseball what it is. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where host Dan Wallach talks to someone who has some sort of a connection to the game we all love. The guest could be a current, a former player, manager, executive, or even a broadcaster. They could be a photographer, a journalist, an author, a historian. It could even be a coach, a collector, a clubhouse attendant, or the curator of a museum. SABR member Dan Wallach is a Chicago native and regrettably a White Sox fan. God bless you, Dan. He is the former executive director of the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina, but has worked with and consulted for numerous baseball museums across the country. As a historian, Dan has traveled all over the United States to visit baseball-related sites, highlighting locations where Shoeless Joe Jackson once played, and he is here tonight to talk with us about all of those experiences and his podcast. Dan Wallach, how are you tonight?
I'm great. How are you guys?
We are so happy to have you in. You set a record for registrants for this meeting with 52. Don't know your own strength now, do you?
It's been hard with everybody kind of shifting away from Twitter and onto Blue Sky. I just don't know what my social media reach is anymore. Every post is a kind of an experiment of, do you post pictures there? Do you post links? Do you put I don't know what works and what doesn't anymore. So I was just blasting this out to everybody on all my different channels. So I'm glad that a bunch of you are here because of that, I hope. And it's great to talk to you and be here.
Well, we are so happy to have you this evening. You have a pretty wide-ranging background in this sport. And you never even took the field as an organized player, an organized baseball. So what was the genesis of your baseball fandom? How did you get into this sport?
I started learning about the history from a very early age. And to me, the team that was prevalent in every single story that I was reading as a little kid was the New York Yankees. So, even though I'm from Chicago, I grew up a White Sox fan. I fell in love with the Yankees and their history, and Mickey Mantle was my guy from a very young age. So I wore number 7 growing up. I've got the number 7 tattooed over my chest and on my over my heart. Mickey's always been my guy. I don't think he's the best player of all time. I think Willie Mays is, but Mickey's my favorite. So I've just always loved the history. And growing up in Chicago, I was born in November of 1986. So a couple of years after I was born, 8 Men Out came out. Next year after that, the Field of Dreams came out. So all throughout my childhood, I watched those movies and learned about the Black Sox scandal story, and just learning about the history of the White Sox and everything that came with that. In 2009, my parents retired and moved to the Greenville, South Carolina area, and that was the year after the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum had opened. So my first visit to go visit my parents, we were like, hey, let's go check out this new museum that opened up. And we're walking around and just fell in love with it. It happened to be a couple days before the very first ever vintage baseball game between the Ty Cobb Museum and the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum. So as my parents and I were walking around the museum, the original curator came up to me and she's like, hey, you look like you play ball. And I was 21 at the time, so I wasn't playing ball, but I had, and I was, it wasn't very long before that I was still playing a little bit. So I was like, yeah, I'm in town this Saturday, and she asked me to play in the game, and I was like, yeah, why not? We've got nothing else going on. And it was just an event that was amazing. We played 1860 style ball. There were historians and experts and researchers and authors and descendants from both players who flew in from all over the country for that event. And so every year I made that game my reason to go visit my parents. So one year they'd play the game in Greenville, South Carolina, and the Ty Cobb Museum would field a team from Royston, Georgia, and come up to play us. The next year, they'd host the game in Royston, Georgia, and we'd go down and play them, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So after doing that for about 10 years, the original curator of the museum, her name is Arlene Markley, she was getting ready to retire. She's, almost 80 years old at the time, and the museum didn't really have anybody to take over for her. So after knowing me for a decade, the board of directors asked if I wanted to come take over. And I lived in Chicago at the time, and I brought that to their attention, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we know you'd have to move here." So it was a lot of thought went into that decision, but I decided to go to South Carolina for the job, and I was there for about 3 years, so it was cool.
So you got connected with that museum when the original curator brought you in as a ringer for a vintage baseball game.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really amazing. The museum was the house that Joe and Katie Jackson lived in the last 15 years or so of their lives. Joe actually died in that house.
Yep.
And the house was originally about 3 miles away from where it's located now. They picked it up off its foundation and moved it to the property that's right across the street from the Greenville Drive Stadium in Greenville. It's called Floor Field. It's built like a mini Fenway Park. The Red Sox minor league affiliate, at the time they were a low A affiliate. Now I believe they're high A. But it's got a mini green monster in left field. You can sit up on top, on the seats on top of it. It's a really great minor league stadium. I believe in 2017 they were named the #1 best minor league franchise of any level in the entire country. So they do a really nice job there. It's beautiful, well run, and so it was always a great place to visit. And when they offered me the position, it was one of those things that's like, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. If you say no, you'll never get it again. And so I just felt like I had to say yes. And during my time there, I oversaw the building was moved again, just from one part of the property across the street from Floor Field to a different part of that property. But then we also had an addition built that acted as basically our gift shop, and a couple other exhibits went in there, but doubled the size of the museum. And it was a really fun experience. With Shoeless Joe Jackson, there aren't a ton of game used things out there, and the ones that are out there are either tough to verify that they were really used by Joe, or they're hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we had to be pretty creative on what we put in the museum, and that was, to me, the most fun part. We didn't have a ton of photos of the house when Joe and Katie lived in it. So one of the photos that we did have was a picture of Joe sitting in a chair in the corner by the fireplace in the living room, holding a trophy. And so I took that picture and blew it up. And that was one of the things, like the very first thing you see when you walked in the house was this photo of Joe. And I traveled around the country for 8 months hunting down the different items that are in the background of that photo. So there were 2 radios, one big one from 1929 on the ground, and then a small one from 1941 that was on top of that. I found both of those radios. I found the flower vases that were on top of the radios. I found the little cast iron dog statue that was on the ground right in front of the fireplace. I found the drum table that he was sitting next to. I found a chair that looked just like the chair he was sitting in. So you walk into this house, and the very first thing you see is this corner set up exactly like Joe. We've got the photo of him sitting right there. So you could see, the fireplace is exactly the same as it was in the photo. I also have in my personal collection, I won an auction years ago for some Polaroids and some photos that were in the Jackson family scrapbooks. And one of the photos was the mantle of that fireplace. In 1951, the Cleveland Indians, they were the Indians at the time, created the Cleveland Indians Hall of Fame. And so their inaugural class, Joe was one of the 10 players that was inducted into that class. And so each of the 10 players was sent this gold clock. Joe happened to pass away just before they were able to send that clock out to the people who are included in that list. But Earl Averill is one of them. I believe his family still has his clock, but I know the make and model of that clock. And in this photo that I have from the Jackson family scrapbook, it shows that Katie put the clock right on the mantle, right where Joe is sitting in this original picture. So while the clock isn't in the picture with Joe in it, I have another one that we triangulate and we know exactly where it was. So one of the people who came through our museum when we first reopened heard me tell this story. I had a picture of, basically blew up the picture of the clock that I had and was said, hey, this is what the story is here. And he goes, I think I have a clock like that. And I was like, oh, I'm sure you've got one that looks kind of like it, but it's a really kind of a rare clock. It's from 1951. He's like, no, I'm pretty sure my grandpa has that clock. And sure enough, he had the exact same make and model. So he donated the clock to the museum and we put it right on the mantle, right where it went. So little things like that, we're never going to be able to afford a game used jersey. We're never going to be able to find, the uniform he wore during the 1917 World Series. But you could still get creative and make it a fun, interactive museum and tell these stories and round him out as a person. Because to me, there are very few baseball museums in the country that are dedicated to a particular player. There's the Babe Ruth Museum, there's the Yogi Berra Museum, Roberto Clemente. There's a handful, Ty Cobb.
Ty Cobb, yep.
There used to be the Bob Feller Museum. There used to be the Ted Williams Hitters Hall of Fame, but after those two guys passed away, the interest in their museums kind of died as well because they could no longer show up and sign autographs there. So people kind of stopped supporting them. But these individual player museums, you can't really, it's difficult to cater to everybody because the fans who go there who are enamored with the statistics, you don't need to tell them the stats because they already know them. And if they don't know them off the top of their head, they know exactly where to find them. You can go to Baseball Reference. You can go to, all the places where you can go to look. The people who hear about that stuff know where to go to look. So the people who don't care about the stats want to hear the personal stories and want to hear the anecdotes and want to hear when Joe lived in Cleveland and played for the Cleveland Naps and the Cleveland Indians from 1910 to 1915. He and Katie bought a house that was 2 blocks away, right on Lexington Avenue, where League Park was. And every single game, Katie would sit in the same seat in the stands. So when Joe would look up to find her, he knew exactly where to look. And no matter what the score was at the 7th inning stretch, Katie would get up and walk home and start cooking dinner. So by the time the game was over, Joe would have a hot meal ready to come home to. Like, those are the types of stories that you want to hear at a baseball museum. You don't care what his slugging percentage was in 1919, and if you do care, you already know what it is. So that was the challenge, that there's been so many things written about Joe and said about Joe over the years to kind of debunk the myths and fact check, essentially. Just because something showed up in a newspaper doesn't necessarily make it true. Just because he was quoted in an interview in 1912 doesn't mean he said those words. So that was the challenge. But that's what I live for. That's, to me, that's the type of research that is fun to do.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, but and that's great. But the one thing I want to ask that hit me as you've been talking about that is just listening to your voice and the inflection in your voice, as nutty as that sounds. It tells me just how enthusiastic you are about Jackson, his history, his legacy, and that museum. How did you first get interested in Joe Jackson? Was it because of your hiring at the museum? Did you have an interest in him prior? What sparked your interest?
No, like I said earlier, it was from before I could even remember and create, actual memories as a developed brain. 8 Men Out came out when I was 2 years old, and
Right.
The Dreams came out when I was 3. So I spent my entire childhood growing up watching those movies.
Okay.
And learning about the Black Sox scandal, learning about Joe Jackson, watching the scene in Field of Dreams where Kevin Costner is driving the tractor and telling his daughter, this is who Joe Jackson was. This is okay, not to kind of go off on a tangent, but it all comes back together. So during that scene, he talks about, Kevin Costner's character talks about how Joe's nickname was the place where triples go to die. And I, growing up a White Sox fan, knew that Joe played left field when he was with the White Sox. Well, nobody hits triples to left field. So to me, that nickname never made sense. And it wasn't something that impressed me. Like, it was a cool nickname. It sounded cool. There was a guy in the 1800s whose nickname was Death to Flying Things because he was an outfielder who caught a ton of, baseballs. Like, that's cool. It sounds great. But the place where triples go to die when you play left field doesn't mean anything. Well, the further I got into doing the research, Joe played right field in Cleveland. And at League Park, it was only 290 down the right field line, but the wall in right field was 40 feet high. Some people think maybe even 45 feet high. The way that the wall was constructed in right field was there were like these concrete pillars essentially, and then metal like panels in between those concrete pillars. But at the playing surface, they weren't flush. So the pillars kind of stuck out a little bit, and then the metal was a little bit recessed. So if a ball was hit to right field, basically everything in the air was going to hit off the wall because the wall was so close. But you never knew where that ball was going to land once it hit the wall because it could carry him in a crazy way. The above where the wall stopped, there was kind of a net. Sometimes the ball would drop straight down. So like, it was a very difficult position to play right field, specifically in Cleveland at League Park. But Joe was so fast and he had a cannon for an arm that even if the ball took a crazy bounce, he was still going to get to it and hold you to a double. So that's where he gets the nickname, the place where triples go to die. And that is impressive. Like, having that nickname as a left fielder means nothing. But when you learn the story, he got it as a right fielder playing in one of the most difficult right fields to play in all of baseball. Now it's like, okay, this guy's a superstar. So yeah, it's a roundabout way of answering your question. This has been a lifelong pursuit. I got much deeper into it because of my hiring at the museum, but it was something I had been interested in for years, starting in 2009 when I went to go visit my parents and play in that vintage game. The fandom, or like it just became something I couldn't stop. So yeah, I've been doing research for decades and collecting, like actively collecting Shoeless Joe Jackson stuff for years. I have Joe's signature tattooed on my right foot, which is the lead foot in, when Joe was batted left-handed. So his lead foot when he would take a swing was his right foot. But I got it on my foot so you can only see that tattoo when I'm shoeless. And I got the tattoo to be 3.56 inches wide from end to end. His career batting average was 356. So like, none of this stuff is an accident. It's crazy, but it's my crazy.
That's okay. Everybody, as far as I am concerned, every member of SABR has their own crazy.
Yep.
And yours is fascinating. And there's already comments in the chat. Mary Shea made the comment, Dan's attention to detail is amazing. And I've already got members begging to ask you questions. So I'm going to tell folks, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button. Once you hit that button, you're going to see another button that says raise hand. Hit the raise hand button. We will get you in line to ask questions of our presenter tonight, Dan Wallach, and I am sure he is going to have some great answers for you. One of the people on this call tonight is the great Jacob Pomranke, who is an expert, as far as I am concerned, and probably everybody else on this call, on the Black Sox scandal. And we're going to get to that subject because you can't talk about Jackson without talking about that. And I'm sure Jacob is going to chime in on that. But Sean Moore's hand is up. Sean, unmute. If you could turn on your camera, that would be fantastic too. But you are up. There he is. How you doing, Sean?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Bruce.
Go get him, man.
Okay, Dan, love your presentation so far. So I'm hoping you can help me with a personal Shoeless Joe Jackson quest I've had for a while, which is I've searched the internet, every nook and cranny of it, to find a actual picture, a photograph of Shoeless Joe Jackson without his shoes on, either in his uniform or in civilian life. And I've never found one. I found artwork where it's he's drawn with his shoes off.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if you've ever seen such a photograph.
Do you want the good news or the bad news, Sean?
I just want the news.
So you can officially stop looking because you will never find that photo.
Good to know.
The story of how he got that nickname, it was June 6, 1908. He was playing in a game for the Carolina Association, Greenville Spinners, and they were a Class C team. He knew that at the end of the 1908 season, he was going to get called up to the majors most likely. So he bought a new pair of cleats and hoped that by the time he did get called up, they'd be broken in. Well, the first time he wore them, they weren't broken in yet, and they were starting to give him blisters. So by the 7th inning of the game, he takes them off, and nobody noticed until he comes up to the plate in, I think, the bottom of the 7th inning is, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly. And this story is told a million different ways. At the museum, we had a docent named Mike Miller who had been there since 2008. When he was brought on to help volunteer at the museum, he's originally from Greenville, lived there his whole life, but didn't really know a ton about Joe. So he decided, all right, well, if I'm going to work at this museum and tell stories, I need to learn everything there is to know about Joe. So he went and created a volume of every game Joe played in his entire life. Mike found the exact date of this game. It was June 6, 1908. Looking at the newspapers, we know that the game was in Greenville against the Anderson Electricians. If you read stories, most books get this wrong. They say that the game was in Anderson. That's not true. It was in Greenville. It was at a field called Meminger Street Park, which just so happened to be like 4 blocks away from the location of where the museum ended up. So we know exactly where that field was. So in the bottom of the 7th, he comes up to the plate. He hits what the newspapers the next day called the longest home run in the history of the park. As he's rounding third base, the third base side was where the visiting fans sat at Meminger. So one of them notices he's not wearing shoes. He stands up and yells, "You shoeless son of a bitch!" And that's where he gets the nickname. So the next day, in the crowd that day was a guy named Scoop Latimer. At the time, he was about 13 years old, but already working with the Greenville News. And the next day, it goes in the paper. He calls him the Shoeless Wonder. Within the next 2 weeks, every newspaper in the country has this story about the Shoeless Wonder from South Carolina. And Joe hated that nickname because he knew the connotation of it, especially being somebody who was always self-conscious about the fact that he was illiterate. He never went to school a day in his life. From the time he was 6 years old, he was working in the cotton mills in Greenville. So he was mortified that people were calling him shoeless when he was already kind of thought of by the outsiders as an unintelligent person. So for the rest of his life, he did whatever he could to make people think that he had money, but not in a flashy way. He just always made sure he dressed nicely. He wore very nice shoes. He drove very nice cars. He wore nice hats. So that's the only game in his entire career that he didn't wear shoes. He did it for 3 innings and never, ever again. And would have kind of like you hear stories all the time about Joe DiMaggio would never be photographed unless he was fully in uniform or fully dressed in a suit. You'd never see a photo of him getting dressed in the locker room or getting undressed in the locker room because he wouldn't allow it. Joe is kind of the same way with shoes. You will never find a picture of him not wearing shoes because it's not something he would allow to have happened.
That is a wonderful answer to my question. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here, Sean.
Dan Perry in the chat asks, was he wearing socks or was he truly barefoot?
He was wearing socks, actually.
Okay.
Hi, Perry.
That's something I never knew. She's waving. Scott Morrissey in the chat talked about a picture of that right field wall.
Mm-hmm.
You should be able to see that now, folks.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see, looking at this picture, that the concrete pillars and the metal like sheets aren't flush. So just imagine a ball hitting that wall, and then above it is that screen. So you never knew where the ball was going to carry him. So the second baseman at League Park, whether it was for the home team or the away, whoever was playing defense, the second baseman was a very important fielder because they were expected to kind of help out and get out into the outfield, that they were going to help out if a ball caromed in a crazy way and the right fielder wasn't able to play it. So that's, again, what made Joe the place where triples go to die, was the fact that he didn't need a second baseman's help. He was going to get the ball himself, and he was going to know the angles to play and be able to fire the ball and keep somebody from getting a third.
Karen Holland's got her hand up. I'm going to go to Karen. You can unmute, my friend.
Yes,
There you go.
this is excellent.
Thanks,
I would
Karen.
like to know, how many stories have you told were true or were rumors?
In terms of what exactly? Like what kind of stories?
In terms of his life, his learning about baseball, knowing that he couldn't see, about his shoes,
Mm-hmm.
about him being illiterate. I mean, I just
Yeah,
wonder how many stories that you find are real.
I'm not sure how to really quantify an answer, but there were stories that we've been told for decades that turned out to be not true at all. Bruce mentioned that Jacob is in here. Jacob and SABR, specifically the Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, in 2019 came out with a project called the 8 Myths Out Project, where they debunked the top 8 myths associated with the Black Sox scandal. And that was a huge part of our research and presentations inside the museum. It changed the way that people learned about the Black Sox scandal and changed the way that people thought about how that entire thing happened. For years, it was assumed, because of Elliot Asnoff's book that came out in 1963 and then was turned into the movie in 1988, that the players were taken advantage of because they were naive and didn't know any better, and the gamblers were just taking advantage of them. Well, it turns out that it was the players who approached the gamblers. The players knew exactly what they were doing. There was precedent of teams from dating back to the 1870s that were throwing baseball games, and rumors were swirling that multiple World Series before 1919 had been thrown or compromised in some way. So Jacob and the research that the Black Sox Scandal Research Committee did was invaluable and debunked so many of the stories we've been told. Again, one of the great things about actually being able to be in Greenville was talking to people who knew Joe. Not too many of them are around anymore, but Joe died in 1951. So there were some older people, like older now, who were 7, 8, 9 years old when Joe passed away, and they remember going to his liquor store. They remember living across the street from him. One of the women I talked to a few years ago, her name was Lib Bowling. She was 96 at the time I talked to her, I think. And she'd been telling the story her whole life about how Joe Jackson saved her life, because when she was 15 years old, she lived across the street from Joe and Katie. And one Sunday afternoon, when her parents were not home, she felt a sharp pain in her side and thought that she was dying. So she couldn't drive to the hospital because she wasn't old enough to drive and not in physical condition to do it anyways. So she ran across the street to Joe and Katie's house. Joe took her to the hospital. The doctor said that she had appendicitis, and if she would have gotten there 5 minutes later, she'd have died. And so for the rest of her life, she told the story about how Joe Jackson saved her life. And to hear stories like that really, you're never going to read that in a baseball history book. like those are things you can only learn by talking to the people who actually knew him. Those were that's to me the fun part about, kind of being boots on the ground in the communities where these people lived. And it's not just Joe Jackson. I mean, you can go to any community where there were, an old baseball player lived, or, had a career after their baseball career. You're going to hear stories like this about every ball player. To me, that's the fun part.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Was the story about Ty Cobb in Joe's liquor store saying, "Joe, don't you know me?" Something like that. Was that story true, or was that a myth?
That one actually is true. So it was reported by Grantland Rice. Ty Cobb and Grantland Rice were at the Masters golf tournament one year. I believe it was 1941, I want to say. And after the tournament was over, they were going to drive up to North Carolina and go hunting together. And on the way, Ty realized, oh, we're going to pass right through Greenville, or we can route a way to get right through Greenville. And Joe Jackson lives there. Let's go say hi. And so after they make this trip, Grantland Rice writes about it. But again, like we talked about earlier, just because something shows up in a newspaper, even today, doesn't necessarily mean that it's exactly true. So you kind of had to take it with a grain of salt. That happened in 1941. So here we are 80 years later. Is it necessarily true? Is everyone gonna believe it? Who knows? But again, being able to be in Greenville, I spoke with a man named Joe Anders, and he was Joe Jackson's protege, essentially. In 1942, he signed a contract with the New York Yankees. He was going to be their new third baseman. He was an absolute star in the Textile League here in Greenville. He's in the Textile League Hall of Fame. The Textile League was in Greenville. There were, at its peak, 18 different cotton mills within a 3-mile radius. Each of them had their own baseball team to kind of keep morale up. And so all these teams played against each other. Those 18 teams formed a league. It was called the Textile League. So that's where Joe got his start playing. He was 13 years old playing in this league that was meant for the biggest and strongest people who worked at the cotton mills in Greenville. And as a 13-year-old, he's on the men's team. As a 15-year-old, he's the best player in the league. So that's where Joe gets his start. Well, Joe Anders is about 30 years younger, and he, to this day, is thought of as the best player in Textile League history. So he signs this contract with the Yankees. Then World War II kind of breaks, and he decides he's going to enlist in the military and forgoes the contract with the Yankees and never plays Major League Baseball. Anyways, Joe Anders was still alive when I first was going to Greenville to go visit my parents and play in these vintage games. So he has told the story in person that he was at the liquor store when Ty Cobb was there. So Ty Cobb and Grantland Rice show up, and Joe Jackson kind of starts calling his buddies to be like, hey, Ty Cobb is in town. I want you to come meet him. And Joe Anders was one of the guys who was there that day as well. So not only do we have it in writing from Grantland Rice, who verified that it was there, but that could have just been a story that a really nice, writer came up with. But we have it verified from somebody who knew Joe in real life and was literally there that day with him. So that story did actually happen.
I'm sitting here and I'm kind of reflecting a little bit on all the information and stories that we've had so far in this podcast, in this video tonight. I haven't even touched your podcast yet. Good grief! Buckle up. We could be here a while.
Got nothing planned tonight but this.
Yes,
as long as you want me.
Yes. And I've got other questions for you along that line, but I'm going to step aside for Scott Morrissey. Scott, unmute for us, please, and ask your question of Dan Wallach. Go.
Yes. Thanks, Dan. And really so many great anecdotes you've been telling us tonight. Anyways,
Thanks.
My question for you, Dan, in learning about Shoeless Joe Jackson, because I know kind of the thing with the 1919 White Sox, that there was basically a bit of a clique, the good guys, some guys on this side, some guys on this side. So I know Jackson was good friends with Lefty Williams, and some other people too. Who were some of his best? Did he have best friends on other teams too? For instance, were he and Babe Ruth ever close? Maybe Walter Johnson, Sam Crawford, some of the other great stars from back then.
So great question. When it comes to the White Sox, Lefty Williams was his best friend. They were roommates on the road. They were hunting buddies together in the off season. We've got a picture of the two of them going hunting one year. It seemed like he was also pretty close with Happy Felsch. Makes sense. You know, Happy was a center fielder, so Joe played right beside him in the outfield. They were all kind of in that same, like, the dirty Sox, you know, the black Sox clique, as you said. If you look at team photos from the years that Joe was on the White Sox, he's usually next to Happy Felsch, or close by. So yeah, they were the friends of the team there. When it comes to the other players you mentioned, I wouldn't necessarily call him friends with Babe Ruth, but they definitely respected each other. There's photos of the two of them together. In fact, the one famous photo of the two of them sitting next to each other on the bench, it was Babe is in a Yankees uniform and Joe's in a White Sox uniform, so we know it happened in 1920. We actually know the exact date. Off the top of my head, I want to say it was June 16th, 1920. If you look really closely at that photo, and some photos that you find online have it cropped out, but there's one person sitting in the stands behind them. That person is Arnold Rothstein. So next time you find that photo, there's some colorized versions of it out there that are a little bit higher resolution. I am almost certain that's Arnold Rothstein, based on the other photos I've seen of Arnold at the time. And there's David Petruccia wrote a book called Rothstein, where Arnold Rothstein is on the front cover wearing literally the same exact outfit, same hat, same everything that he's wearing in this photo with Babe and Joe. But Babe Ruth and Joe Jackson swapped bats at that series when the Yankees were in Chicago. And for a couple games, so the next series or the next road trip, the White Sox went and played in Boston. And I want to say the pitcher for Boston was Sam Jones, who threw a little bit slower. So Joe actually used Babe Ruth's bat and hit a home run. And, you know, this is still, I guess, 1920. It's the start of the live ball era. But the reporters after the game asked him, hey, you know, you hit this home run with Babe Ruth's bat. Are you going to keep using Babe's bat and hit home runs like Babe does? And Joe said something along the lines of, no, you know, Babe's bat is just way too heavy for me. Yeah, there you go, this picture. So that man in the upper right corner, that's Arnold Rothstein. And so Joe said, no, Babe's bat is way too heavy, but I was able to get it around today because the pitcher was a little bit slower. But no, I'm going to go back to my bat. I think I do pretty well with my bat. Joe that year batted .382, I think. Babe Ruth said that he modeled his swing after Joe Jackson. You know, you mentioned Walter Johnson. He said that Joe Jackson was the hardest out. All of his contemporaries said that Joe was the greatest natural hitter. Even Ty Cobb said that Joe was the greatest natural hitter who ever lived. He said, though, if Joe thought about hitting the way that I hit, he'd be a better hitter than me. But since I'm, you know, I really study the you know, how to hit, that makes me a better hitter. But everybody acknowledged Joe is the best natural hitter. He could just roll out of bed and get 2 hits a day. So I'm not sure how many friends he had in the game, but there were certainly his contemporaries respected him, and there were players that he liked and respected too.
I love how these meetings evolve when we have this question and answer type presentations, because I've been asked frequently, you know, how much preparation do you do and how much time do you take to get these things going? And I like to let these evolve organically, like this one is tonight. And my goodness, the information and stories that, oh man, Dan, I'll tell you,
That's what I live for. Like, this, to me, this is the fun part of it. You know, like, as I'm sure there are people in this chat right now who are researchers. You know, obviously Jacob is here, but you kind of you work so hard and spend so many hours alone and reading this stuff and deciding what is real and what is not. When you find something that's worth sharing with people, you want to share it with them. And so to me, like, I love coming on stuff like this. I love, that's one of the reasons I have my podcast is, or, you know, have the newsletter is you just want to share the stuff that you find with people who are going to find it interesting.
Okay, thank God you mentioned podcast because this is a really great segue. Ryan and Craig, keep your hands up. I am going to get to you, I promise. But Dan, you have this fantastic podcast.
Thank you.
Talk to me about that, how that came about, how you get guests. Tell me how that goes.
Yeah, so I started the podcast when I was at the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum because the museum had no social media presence at all when I took over. There was not a Twitter account. There was no Instagram account. They had a Facebook page, but never really posted on it. And I knew that, you know, it was the year 2019. You know, like people needed to be able to interact with you on the internet in some way. If you wanted to have support, if you wanted to make money, if you wanted to keep your doors open, like you needed to have more than just the people of Greenville who were interested in baseball supporting you. And so I knew we needed to build a following, and I figured, hey, a podcast is a cool way to do it. One of my first ideas was, all right, well, we're going to have all the episodes be about Shoeless Joe Jackson. And then the more I kind of thought about that, I was like, man, we are going to run out of content in 10 episodes. Like, if it's going to be a long form thing, like, okay, do we do one episode per season of his career? Like, I don't know. I just knew that going with a podcast that was just going to be about Shoeless Joe was not going to be something that you could sustain forever. So I was like, okay, still want to do the long form thing. Let's just talk to different people, and you know, every season or so we'll have an episode that is specifically dedicated to Joe Jackson in some way, but not every single episode throughout the entire podcast history has to be about Joe. So I just started reaching out to people that I was friends with or followed on social media and that had some sort of association to the game. You know, when I first started the podcast, ideally I was going to eventually get to talking with current players. You know, I'd love to talk to people like Mike Trout or Mookie Betts or, you know, people like that, but I don't know if we'll quite get there. But there are so many other people, as you mentioned at the very beginning of this, when you were doing the introduction, there are so many people who make up the game of baseball. It's not just the players on the field. So in season 1, we talked to Mike Miller, who I mentioned earlier. He was the docent at the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum. So that episode is all about Shoeless Joe's early career and life in Greenville. Then we spoke with Greg Kreinler, the artist, about his hyper real paintings. I'm actually in Cooperstown right now. I'm at the Oda Saga. That's where I'm recording right now. So the paintings behind me are not mine. I'm in a hotel room here in Cooperstown. My taste is a little different than that, but we were at the Hall of Fame. My mom is here with me, and we saw Greg's painting in real life. Like, if you guys haven't seen a painting of his in person, find a place that's within 2 or 3 states driving distance of you that has one of his paintings and go look. They're unbelievable online. They are even better in person. It's truly remarkable what he does. And if you guys were at the SABR convention in Minneapolis and went to CHS Field, there was a painting of his at the City of Baseball Museum.
Yep.
But just amazing. Then we also talked to Phil Dixon in season 1. He's a Negro Leagues author and historian. He's been researching the Negro Leagues for more than 40 years. I talked to Craig Purcell, who was or is a docent at the Field of Dreams movie site and gives tours inside the house. Talked to Brian Bernardoni, who is the official historian of Wrigley Field. So we talked all about the history of Wrigley Field and Weekman Park before it was called Wrigley Field. We talked about all the different sports and events that were held there. It's not just Cubs baseball for the past 110 years. There's been all sorts of events there, from political rallies to ski jumping competitions to women's softball and baseball. The first the first night game in Wrigley Field history was not 8-8-88 or 8-9-88 because it was rained out. It was in 1943 when the women's softball all-star game was held at Wrigley Field, and they brought in portable lights to play under the lights at Wrigley Field. So those are the types of stories that you learn from talking to people who are experts in their field. And it could be anybody. You know, we've talked to Marjorie Adams, who is the great granddaughter of Doc Adams, who invented the position of shortstop and literally wrote the laws of baseball in the 1850s that are the rules that we mostly play the game by today. Talked with a guy named Warren Brown, who was the bat boy for the Big Red Machine Cincinnati Reds from 1970 to 72. And he told all sorts of stories about, you know, hosting the All-Star game and going to the World Series in Oakland and going to, you know, the new stadium that they built in Cincinnati and playing on artificial turf for the first time, and how the team started, I think, 70-30. And then the artificial turf was so hot in the summer that the entire team would just get dehydrated by the end of the year. And they had built such an incredible lead in the first half because they got out to an incredible start that they made the playoffs in the World Series, but they were just beat. You know, they were exhausted, and you don't hear stories like that anywhere else. So to me, I love talking to all sorts of people. I think Perry Barber's in the room right now with us. We saw her in the Hall of Fame. She was a guest in season 2 as well, talking about umpiring and women in baseball. The last episode that just came out was with Ashton Lansdale, who plays for the U.S. Women's National Team. And this past year, she had a 3-week contract with the Savannah Bananas. So all sorts of people. Earlier this year, I spoke with Nancy Faust, who was the organist for the Chicago White Sox for 41 years, the person who invented walk-up music when she first played Jesus Christ Superstar every time Dick Allen would come to the plate in 1972. And it just evolved from there. And now you can't go to a sporting event without hearing specific songs related to specific people. She was the one who started that. She invented "Na Na Hey Hey Kiss 'Em Goodbye." Like, she brought this song that had come out, I think, 6 years earlier and faded away. And driving to the park one day, heard it on the radio and thought, "Oh, that song Goodbye, that would be a good thing to play if a pitcher gets knocked out of the game." And so she played it in July of 1978, I believe, and or 77 or 79, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's in the podcast. And it immediately took off, and the whole crowd started chanting along and singing along, and now it's a phenomenon. Like every sporting event you go to, they play it in some capacity. So one of the other things I like to do, and Jacob Pomrenke was one of my guests as well. He was the first episode of season 3. We talked a lot about SABR. The first half of the episode is all about SABR and its many benefits. And then the second half of the episode is all about the 8 Myths Out project and the Black Sox scandal. So I've spoken with former Negro League players, former All-American Girls Professional Baseball League players, Bobby Richardson, the 1960 World Series MVP and teammates with Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris and so on and so on. I mean, I've spoken with all sorts of people. To me, you don't have to be a baseball statistician lover or a baseball history lover. Like, no matter what part of baseball you like, there's going to be an episode that will intrigue you. And one of my favorite things that I do with the podcast is we also have our website, shoelesspodcast.com. And every episode I create what I call liner notes. So as you're listening to the episode, and these are particularly helpful when we talk with artists, whatever we're talking about. So if it's a particular photo or a particular painting, I'll throw up a picture on the website of exactly what we're talking about. And then the caption will be links to do further research. So one of my recent episodes was with Todd Radom, who is a graphic designer who created, he's done World Series logos, Super Bowl logos. He created the logo and uniform set for the Washington Nationals, for the Milwaukee Brewers in 1994, all sorts of different teams. the Los Angeles Angels current uniform and logo set is from Todd. So we're talking about all sorts of visual things that, like, yeah, the conversation is interesting if you just listen to the audio, but when you add in this visual aspect as well, going through the liner notes, it really adds a layer of context that makes it, to me, so much more enjoyable. Because I know if I'm listening to something like that, I'm going to pause every 20 seconds when they talk about a particular picture or they talk about a particular logo, and I'm going to find on Google what they're talking about. So I do that work for you. All you have to do is sit back and relax and listen. And hopefully you guys enjoy it, but I have a lot of fun putting that together.
Jimmy Parker has a comment in the chat. Dan's liner notes for the podcast are practically novels. Talk about attention to detail. This whole interview has been a demonstration of attention to detail. I am not worthy right now. Ryan McClanahan, save me. Unmute and save me, man. How you doing?
Good. How are you guys
Ryan
doing?
knew this was going to be a big deal tonight. He even wore a jacket.
Yeah, I did.
Right? Go.
And so, Dan, this is really awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.
How accurate is Elliot Azanov's book? In regards to Joe Jackson.
Jacob is probably the better person to answer this question, but in short, not accurate. It's a great story. It makes for a great movie, but it paints him in a pretty negative light. It makes him out to be kind of a bumbling fool who is easily taken advantage of. One of the lines that we like to use at the museum when I was there, there's a difference between uneducated and unintelligent. And while Joe was uneducated, he never went to school a day in his life. He was certainly not unintelligent. He was a businessman from the time he was a little kid, going and playing in these textile league games. And he knew that every time he would make a great play in the field or hit a long home run, or his line drives back then were called blue darters. Anytime something like that would happen, his little brothers would go around in the stands with their hats turned over and take money, as tips from all the people watching the game. And so there'd be times where he'd make $10, $12, $15 in a game when the average mill worker was making that in a week. And so he knew, man, if I play well and if I'm, affable and likable, people are going to support me financially. Then he started having businesses outside of the game of baseball. He had a pool hall. He had a cigar store during his playing career. You guys mentioned Lefty Williams earlier. After Joe was banned from baseball, he sold one of his businesses to Lefty Williams for $1 just to make it a legal transaction. But kind of taking care of his buddy, he had this well-established business in Chicago, but he just didn't want to be in Chicago anymore. So he sold it to Lefty Williams, and I think a couple of years later, Lefty ran it into the ground. But Joe was a successful business person. After his playing career ended, he had a dry cleaning business in Savannah, Georgia. And one of the trips I went on was going to Savannah and looking through their city directory, their archives, to find everything I could find out about this dry cleaning business, because there isn't a lot out there on the internet. And so I found a newspaper article that was talking about how they were so successful that they needed to open a second location. They had over 20 employees working for them. He's making all sorts of money. He was through 1924, 1925, Joe's playing for Waycross, Georgia and Americus, Georgia on these barnstorming teams and making a lot of money. And any other player, especially from the Black Sox, who wasn't allowed to play professional baseball, would have been thrilled to make the money that Joe was making playing in these games. But Joe stopped playing because he was making more money at the dry cleaners. So he focused on that, even though he's still, he's only 37, 38 years old at the time, which sounds old in today's standards. But back then, especially if he's only playing 60, 70 games a year, back then, guys like Ty Cobb played till they were 40, 41, 42. And those were kind of his contemporaries. Like, he should have been playing 140 games for 3 or 4 more years. but he decided, hey, I'm making more money at the dry cleaners than I am playing baseball, and I don't need to be away from home. I don't need to travel. I don't need to eat sandwiches out of paper bags. Like, I can live at home and make more money. So I went down to Savannah and looked through the city directory and found that they did open a second location. I found the address of it, but then I looked through the next year because in 1932, Joe's mom got sick and she lived in Greenville still. So Joe and Katie sold everything in Savannah, moved back up to Greenville to take care of his mom. So I looked in the 1932 and 1933 Savannah directories and found that they were actually getting ready to open a third location of the dry cleaning business. And I had never heard or read that anywhere. So he was very successful. When they get back to Greenville, the Greenville Spinners, which was the team he was playing on in 1908 when he got the nickname Shoeless Joe, they find out he's back in town. It's August of 1932. And they're like, hey, Joe, as long as you're here, you want to throw a uniform on and make some money? And so they were paying him $100 a game to go play for the Greenville Spinners again. And so now he's, he was 45 years old at that time, and played for a few more years sporadically, not necessarily on the Greenville Spinners, but in other, he played for the Woodside Mill team. His younger brother was also a really good pitcher. So he played and managed on the 1937 Woodside Mill team. So at that point, he's 50 years old. Anyways, when he gets back to Greenville to take care of his mom, he opens a barbecue restaurant, which I don't think it was unsuccessful, but it was short-lived. I think they pulled their money out of that, and then that's when they opened the liquor store. And the liquor store made them a ton of money. There are interviews that Joe gave later in life, I think 1949 or so, where he's claiming that he was making $100,000 a year at that liquor store. I don't quite believe that number, but I wouldn't be shocked if it's close. But that's a big amount of money in 1949. But whatever the number was, they were very successful. They had a beautiful brick house in Greenville, South Carolina. They had nice cars. They didn't have kids. So, it's not like they had to spend money a lot. They were content, and living well. So I know that was a long way to answer your question of how accurate was 8 Men Out. Not very, but it's a blessing and a curse, that movie and that book, because it makes people familiar with the story in general. It gets people familiar with the characters and the players, both literal and figurative. But everybody who walked in the museum kind of thought they knew the story of the Black Sox scandal. Oh, you don't even need to go over that. I know the story. I saw the movie. Well, it's like, yeah, but we kind of need to erase your brain because all of what you know is wrong. And again, thanks to Jacob and the Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, like, we were able to tell the most true and most accurate version of Joe's story that had ever been told.
And that information is available at sabr.org/8mythsout. Use the keyword 8mythsout and you'll find it all at sabr.org. So I want to go to our next guy here, the new editor-in-chief of the Elysian Fields newsletter. Yeah, I heard that rumor, Craig. Craig Garrettson, you are up, man. How you doing?
Good. I just wanted to ask a what-if question. As I understand it, the second best offer for Babe Ruth in 1920 offseason was Shoeless Joe Jackson from the White Sox because of the Insurrectos and the Loyal Five. Do you think that would have, with the most popular player in baseball on the White Sox, would that have done something, you think, to kind of quash Landis, maybe not pursuing this as thoroughly, or do you think anything would have happened? How do you think Ruth would have done with the White Sox and Shoeless Joe would have done with the Red Sox?
There's a lot of what ifs in that scenario. I think Babe Ruth would have been successful anywhere, but I think one of the things that made him the pop culture icon that he was being in New York. Obviously the home runs played a big part in that, and he hit a lot of home runs on the road as well. But I think being in Yankee Stadium and having that short right field porch helped him a little bit too. But Babe Ruth was going to be Babe Ruth in any stadium. I mean, you look at, one of my episodes was with a guy named Alex Sheremetyev, who is basically the world's expert on the Philadelphia Athletics. When John Thorne, the official historian for Major League Baseball, has a question about the Philadelphia Athletics, he calls Alex. So I spoke with Alex on my podcast, and Perry talked about this in the chat I saw. What the format of my podcast is, I do a little bit of introduction, talking about who's going to be on the show. Then we do the long form interview. Then my mom and I have a segment where she and I listen to the episode, the interview together, and then we kind of break it down and answer any questions that, as you're listening, might come up. And then when that segment's over, I have kind of like a 5-minute outro where I talk about either some weird statistics or weird stories or something that is somewhat related to the episode we just listened to. And I remember doing the research for that episode with Alex and the Philadelphia Athletics, and looking at Babe Ruth's statistics at Shibe Park. And I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I think he played 170 career games there and hit like 70 home runs or more, like 200 RBI. His slugging percentage was better than anybody in the history of the game. Like, if he would have just played all his games at Shibe Park, so this isn't Yankee Stadium, it's not like he was being helped by a short right field porch there. Like, he was a superstar. He was larger than life. He would have been Babe Ruth wherever he went. Would Joe Jackson have been Joe Jackson at Fenway? I don't know. You know, you'd think a player who was as good a hitter as Joe probably would have figured out a way to hit the ball to the opposite field and just batter the green monster and hit double after double after double. I mean, he was already one of the greatest extra base hitters in the dead ball era. 1920, his only season playing during the live ball era, was arguably his best statistical season. He had his career high in home runs. He had a ton of doubles, a great batting average. I think he batted 380 or 382 that season. So again, he would have figured out as well how to make the ballpark work for him. Your other question about would Landis have pursued, that's assuming that the White Sox throw the World Series or make it to the World Series. You know, like I'm not sure I can answer that hypothetical, because there's just so much that would need to happen to get to that point. But Landis was brought in to clean up the game. So I think when he found out that there was grumblings about the I think at the end of the 1919 season, the Cubs and the Phillies threw a game or fixed a game. That was kind of like, back then there were no playoffs in baseball. So if you had the best record in the American League or the best record in the National League, you just went to the World Series. But that also meant that if you weren't one of the best teams, the last few weeks of your season were kind of meaningless unless you were jockeying for a position to get a bonus at the end of the year. Like if you finished in second or finished in third, you get a couple extra bucks. Well, the Phillies and the Cubs were kind of manipulating the standings in those meaningless games at the end of the season. And yeah, thanks, Scott. And when Landis found that out, that's when he kind of brought them all into the office and was like, hey, what are we doing here? Like, the whole reason I became the commissioner, the whole reason I was hired was to clean up the game. And now I'm hearing that you guys were throwing games. And they were basically like, wait, how are you going to punish us when the White Sox threw the World Series and nothing happened to them? And that's when the floodgates opened. So I think from that point on, he was out to make an example of anybody who gambled, because he didn't just ban them from Major League Baseball. What he said was, if you go back to your hometowns and you play town ball, or you go back to South Carolina, you try to play textile league ball, or you try to barnstorm, anybody that you play with or against, they're also banned from Major League Baseball. So he was trying to ruin these people's lives. It wasn't just, oh, we're going to make sure gambling doesn't happen at the Major League level. He was basically saying, if we find out you gambled, you will never play baseball ever again. And the threat of keeping the people who played with him or against him out of the game as well should have, in his, in Landis's mind, should have been enough to keep anybody from taking that risk ever again. So I don't know what would have happened if Babe Ruth were on the White Sox, if they would have went to the World Series, if they would have thrown it. But I think if Landis would have found out that bad things were happening, he would have ruled with an iron fist the way that he tried to do that.
Ben Abel, that's quite a background you got there, man.
That, my friends, is the 3-foot hot dog from Nat Bailey Stadium in Vancouver, Canada, where the High A Vancouver Canadians play the High A affiliate of the Toronto Blue Jays.
Bring your appetite.
I was an employee at the ballpark last year as a fan services usher, spreading my SABR news and knowledge. Anyway, Dan, thank you for this. And I just had a general question for Bruce right at the beginning of the presentation. And I said to Bruce, I think in the private chat, I said, hey, Bruce, maybe Dan can shed some light or bust some Shoeless Joe Jackson myths for me around 8 men out. But I think Dan has probably more than achieved that in the hour of this talk. So I've got a number of things I can save the chat from this presentation so I can go through and look at some of those resources of Dan's, because I think he's clearly done that here and it's fascinating. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for being here, Ben.
Dave Lipman, how you doing?
Hi there. You can
Go
hear
get
me?
him. Yeah,
Okay.
go get him, man.
My question is, we've been talking about Shoeless Joe Jackson and the 1919 fiasco. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about the 1926 situation when Landis banned Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb for fixing a game, and they both quit as managers of their teams, and then they both went back the following year. They were both back in baseball, with Speaker on the Senators and Cobb with the Philadelphia Athletics. I mean, they were doing a similar thing. They were rigging games, and then they bet on them to make themselves some money. But unlike Jackson, Weaver, and Cicotti, they seem to have gotten away with it, which is pretty bloody bizarre. Some unequal justice.
Yeah, definitely. I think what you're referring to is known as the Dutch Leonard affair.
That's right.
Yeah. To me, you kind of got to look at it from the sports perspective. Is you just had this major scandal 6 years earlier, 1920, 1921, he bans the players. You finally feel like you're on the other end of that with Babe Ruth kind of saving your sport from being thought of as illegitimate. That was the reason why Landis was brought in, was if the public loses faith that the product that you're selling is legitimate, they're going to stop supporting it.
Right.
And Babe Ruth kind of saves the sport and re-energizes people and think like, okay, home runs are exciting, baseball is exciting, we're going to come watch you play. Well, now in 1926, you find out that two of the best players of all time were fixing games also. I mean, the sport could have ended right then and there.
Yeah.
So again, I think Landis, and I'm not a fan of Kenneth Mountain Landis, so don't get it twisted, but
Not many people are, but that's okay.
But I can understand the idea of sweeping that under the rug, because if you don't, the whole sport goes under, I think at that point, or at least becomes a shell of itself. So I don't know if I were in his shoes, if I would have handled it differently. But yeah, like you said, it was a very hypocritical way of handling it when you had just, like we were talking about, ruined the lives of 8 people for doing the same thing.
Yeah, more if you include Dickie Kerr, because he pitched against some of those guys, and Landis tossed him out of the game, and he was one of the clean socks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but he was brought back in though, right?
No, he wasn't. That was it for him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Jacob can give it to you officially. I'm on that committee, but I also have a personal interest in the 1919 fix, because my great uncle was one of the guys who helped fix it.
Oh, wow.
He was a bagman for Arnold Rothstein and an enforcer. So if you won, he brought you the money. If you lost and you didn't pay up, he convinced you to pay up by breaking your kneecaps. He was, when he wasn't doing that, he was he had a crew in the Bronx that would get tips from night watchmen at furniture warehouses, and he and his buddies would drive up there in their truck, and they'd either slip the night watchman $10 or beat the hell out of him, or both, to make it look good. Take the furniture that they wanted, what they couldn't fence, they'd give to other members of my family. And their basic take was, "Oi, that is he. A shame for the neighbors is he, but he brings us good furniture." Anyway, sometime in the early 20s, he started skimming the tape from Rothstein. God knows why. He wasn't around to tell us, because he got whacked by the big bankroll, and he is now forever a cornerstone in the infrastructure of New York. He's holding up the Hellgate Bridge.
Wow.
And the family's reaction was, "Hey, a shame to the neighbors was Izzy, and we're not even getting any more furniture."
Now I know where all my furniture deliveries are. Thanks a lot, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Hey, what do you want me to do? Izzy's in the bridge. I can't bring him back. You know,
I got to tell you, at this point, I'm exhausted with all this information. Dan, holy moly. What a fantastic presentation.
Thank you so much. I was doing a little bit of prep work. Just, I wasn't sure what you guys wanted to talk about, or what you wanted me to touch on, but I was prepared to kind of talk about some of the things that I've done in 2024. I had never written the list out before, and I was like, oh my God, I've done a lot of stuff this year.
Talk to us about that for a couple of minutes.
Let me just run through. So in May, I went to the East West Classic at Doubleday Field in Cooperstown when they released or unveiled the new exhibit at the Hall of Fame for the Negro Leagues. And that was incredible. It was my first time seeing a game at Doubleday Field. Obviously, I'd been there before, but I'd never seen a game there. So that was cool. Then I went to the game at Rickwood Field, the MLB game, and all of the festivities that weekend in June. So that in Birmingham, same thing. I had been there before. I had been on the field. I'd taken pictures, but I had never seen a game there. So when that was announced, I was like, yeah, I got to go. In July, I went to induction weekend at the Hall of Fame for the first time in my life. That was cool. I went to the National Sports Card Collector Show in Cleveland this year. I hosted an 1860 style vintage baseball game on the field at League Park that Jacob played in, a couple other people. Thanks, Donna. Yes, in April, I went to say the Jackie Robinson and the Color Line show in New York. So I'm here in New York. Like I said, I'm in Cooperstown right now with my mom, and I was like, man, I've been to New York a bunch of times this year, and I forgot about that one. So yeah, pretty crazy. That was incredible. Paul Reeferson is one of the guests on my show. He was, season 3, episode 5. He is a collector of photographs and other baseball memorabilia, but specifically he's an expert on photography and had the world's largest Charles Conlon collection that he donated more than 500 pieces to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Just an unbelievable wealth of knowledge. That episode, we spend the first 20 minutes literally not saying the word baseball. We just talk about photography and different processes. So for the rest of the episode, when we're talking about what does it mean to be a type 1, what does it mean to be a collodion print, like all these things, everybody's on the same page. So Paul has been collecting photography, and for 25 years, he's been working on this exhibit in his mind of how is the color line more than just Jackie Robinson, and where have Black players been allowed to play and not been allowed to play dating back to the 1800s. And he found a photo years ago of this guy named Javon Emery, and that photo is actually now in the Hall of Fame, blown up, really huge. One of the first things you see when you walk in on the second floor. We talk about that photo in the podcast, just unbelievable. So yes, in April, he put on a show in New York that I went to, hosted that 1860 style vintage baseball game on the field at League Park, which was really cool. It's a dream of mine to eventually play at every site that I can possibly play where Shoeless Joe Jackson played ball. I think it's gonna probably be a little hard for me to play on the field at Fenway, but if any of you guys have a connection that can make that happen, I'd love to make that happen one day. but being able to do it at League Park was really cool. And Jacob was there for that. Went to the SABR convention in Minneapolis. I went to Pittsburgh on the anniversary of Bill Mazeroski's home run, because every year on the anniversary, a group of people get together and listen to the broadcast. So I've known for years that was something that happened, just never could make it work with my schedule. But this year I made it work. In 2026, I plan on being at the Polo Grounds to listen to the broadcast of Bobby Thompson's Shot Heard Around the World, which will be the 75th anniversary in 2026. So mark your calendars if you guys want to join me there. I was at game 3 of the ALCS this year when the Cleveland Guardians came from behind to win in extras. I went to game 4 of the World Series and saw the new Yankee Stadium for the first time in my life. I've been volunteering for Baseball for All. On my way to Cooperstown this week, my mom and I stopped at Nicholson Bridge in Wyoming County, Pennsylvania, which was the largest concrete structure in the world when it was completed in 1915. And you may be wondering, well, why are you telling me this? This is a baseball presentation? Well, 8 years later, when the old Yankee Stadium was built, they modeled the facade after this bridge, Nicholson Bridge, in Wyoming County, Pennsylvania. So I've got some old postcards of that. I have a big postcard collection, a lot of baseball stadiums and baseball related things. I also have a ton of artifacts related to Hotel Sinton in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where the Black Sox stayed while the games were in Cincinnati during the 1919 World Series. That was where the team decided once and for all, we are going to throw the World Series. I've got postcards and silver and platters and china and teacup, all sorts of stuff, room keys from Hotel Sinton. But I also have these postcards from Nicholson Bridge. So that was one of the things that I was like, hey, we're kind of going to be on the way of when we're going to Cooperstown. Let's take a little detour and stop there. So that's kind of been my last 6 or 7 months. And starting in 2025, the second week in January, I'm going to be officially working at the Baseball Heritage Museum at League Park. So all sorts of good things coming. Really excited for what's up in the pipeline coming up.
All right. Last question for you, Dan.
Yeah.
How is the hospitality at the Otesaga?
I don't know how to answer that if this were in July, but right now we're one of probably 20 rooms that are in this place. So the hospitality is unbelievable because the staff is just begging for something to do because it's pretty dead in Cooperstown at this time of year. Everybody in Cooperstown has just been really, really nice. To me, this is my favorite time of year to go to the Hall of Fame.
Same here. Yep.
So that's why I'm here to interview Josh Rowich on Friday morning for the podcast. He's the president of Hall of Fame.
Okay.
And earlier, if you guys saw my post on Blue Sky, I posted a picture of me wearing my Mickey Mantle, Mitchell and Ness jersey at Yankee Stadium in front of Mickey Mantle's monument at Monument Park. That was not apropos of nothing. It's because earlier today I interviewed Tom Cattall, who was Mickey Mantle's autograph agent. So we talked all about Mickey Mantle and his life, especially after his playing career was over, and what it was like to help him sign autographs and really just be Mickey Mantle's buddy. It was an awesome, awesome experience.
Tell them how they can find that podcast, Dan.
Yeah, it's anywhere that you listen to podcasts. It's called My Baseball History. We're on social media. If you type in @Shoeless Podcast, you'll see something pop up. Gary Sieradkowski did the artwork. If you're familiar with Gary, he's unbelievable. He's a great historian and researcher in his own right, on top of being an amazing artist. Like I said about the liner notes, those are all on my website, which is shoelesspodcast.com. You can listen to the podcast on the website. Every single interview has its own dedicated link, and at the top of every page, you can listen to whatever episode that page is discussing. So just click play and then scroll down as you listen to kind of follow along with the conversations with the photos and videos and links and all sorts of stuff. But yeah, that's where you can find it. Shoeless Podcast everywhere.
Oof. This has been something. Wow.
An hour and 25 minutes. An hour and 25 minutes for an hour talk.
All right, next week.
Thanks, man.
Monday, December 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern, we will have the vice president of the board of directors here, Allison Levin, will be with us to give her SABR 52 presentation, Gender Work, the evolution of WAGs from support system to celebrity influencer. The link
Bruce will
is
wear a
in-
Santa Claus outfit.
Thanks, Donna.
I can't take him anywhere. The link to sign up is in the meeting booklet sent out with the Monday message and is also available on the SABR events calendar at saber.org/events. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you are not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to saber.org/join today. Dan Wallach, you're incredible.
Thank you very much, Bruce. You're not too bad yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate that, but holy cow, what a meeting. This has been spectacular. Dan Wallach, thank you very much. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks everybody for being here too.
Let's get everybody out of here. We'll see you Monday night. Have a good night, everyone.